But Mr. Leader, I mean, you ultimately lost this, and you take personal
Who
responsibility.
lost?
You lost in the
Who
state Supreme
lost? Did
Court.
the voters lose?
What Democrats did in your law
Did
that
the
you
voters
passed.
lose?
Do you take personal responsibility for investing so much time and resources, tens of millions of dollars, in ultimately fruitless effort?
We did the right thing, and this effort is not over. It's just getting started. And by the way, come back to me on November 4th when Democrats have taken back control of the House of Representatives. That's ultimately going to be, what matters. What do the
And if
American
you don't because of
people,
this,
we are going to win the House of Representatives. I'm telling you that right now. I've been telling you that from the very beginning. And by the way, what math are people focused on when they think about the electoral environment that we're in? When Democrats took the House back in 2018, and at minimum we're in the 2018 environment. When Democrats took the House back, we had to flip 24 seats in 2018. 24 seats, which people said was impossible to do. We didn't just flip 24 seats in 2018, we flipped 40. And of those 40 seats, 31 were in districts that Donald Trump had just won.
Here's what nobody's really talking about. Democrats spend all day telling you they're protecting democracy, defending institutions, fighting for a fair representation. But then Virginia happened. And when they lost the redistricting fight, they just lost it. They didn't accept it. They actually started having serious conversations about forcing state Supreme Court justices to retire so they could replace them and overturn the court's decision. That's not protecting democracy. That's overturning it because you didn't like the outcome. Meanwhile, Hakeem Jeffries, that you guys just heard, is running around talking about maximum warfare everywhere all the time, quote unquote, doubling down, making threats, pledging to do this again in 2028. And Abigail Spanberger, Virginia's governor, is basically telling him to shut up because his strategy is destroying her approval ratings. So you got the national Democratic leadership playing one game and the people actually on the ground trying to win elections playing another. This isn't about redistricting anymore. This is about Democrats fracturing because they lost the war they thought they already won. So let's break down what went down in Virginia because it's actually pretty straightforward. Democrats looked at Virginia's congressional districts and saw an opportunity. They spent tens of millions of dollars trying to redraw those lines to completely flip the map. They wanted to go from a situation where Republicans had a 4 to 7 seat advantage to Democrats having a 10 to 1 advantage. That's a total reversal. They thought they had the votes to do it, so they pushed a redistricting referendum and voters actually approved it. But here's where it all falls apart. Virginia's Supreme Court looked at what happened and ruled the whole thing unconstitutional. The map stays the same. The referendum, which was their proposal map, gets blocked. That should have been the end of it. But instead of accepting that loss, instead of saying, okay, we tried, let's move on, Democrats started talking about how to force justices off the court, not just one, multiple justices. The plan was literally to push age limits, get them to retire, and then put them in new justices who would overturn the court's decision and let them redraw the map they want anyway. That's not reforming the courts. That's a takeover dressed up in the language of reform. Now, here's why Spanberger's approval ratings tanked. Virginia voters aren't stupid. They saw what was happening. They watched politicians try to take away representation from people they disagree with, and they didn't like it. Even people who usually vote Democratic looked at that and thought, wait, that's not how this is supposed to work. You're not supposed to pick your voters. Your voters are supposed to pick you. But that's exactly what Democrats were trying to do. Jeffries, though, he's not worried about approval ratings or any of that. He's already moving forward. He publicly said he's going to try this again in 2028. In 2028, that's 2 years away. That tells you this was never just about the 2024 midterms, or in this case, the 2026 midterms. But he's trying to make it as though talking about 2018 and all these dates. But this it's not about the midterms coming up in 2026, not 2024. This is about locking in permanent advantages that would benefit them for a decade without being able to withdraw districts. They can't guarantee winning control of the House. in this upcoming election in November, this 2026 midterms. So they're desperate to manufacture that advantage through the courts instead of earning it through actual electoral momentum. So now let's check out this article. Partisan mud fight or focus on the midterms. Redistricting divides Democrats. Governor Abigail Spanberger of Virginia urged her fellow Democrats, including the House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, to stop talking about drawing new congressional lines for partisan advantage. With Democratic efforts to redraw Virginia's congressional boundaries in shambles for now, two central figures in the fight are at odds over what to do next. Representative Hakeem Jeffries of New York, the minority leader, continues to push for quote unquote maximum warfare everywhere all the time, vowing with a phrase he borrowed from Republicans to redraft lines to give Democrats an advantage not only in Virginia but across the country before the 2020 elections. Governor Abigail Spanberger of Virginia, whose approval ratings dropped perceptually as she campaigned for her state's redistricting referendum, is urging her party to drop its quest for partisan advantage in favor of a more pressing issue, winning the midterms. As she said in her word, quote, "It is outrageously premature of us to be talking about any sort of redistricting or map changing effort when we have to win the most consequential midterms of my lifetime this November," Ms. Spanberger said in an interview this week, taking a unsettled jab at Mr. Jeffries and reflecting a broader disquiet among Democrats about how to counter Republican gerrymanders after the Virginia Supreme Court ruled the referendum there unconstitutional. The issue burst into view this week on the sidelines of a policy conference hosted by the Center for American Progress in Washington. Ms. Spanberger said her party's continued focus on redistricting was a distraction from addressing affordability, President Trump's leadership, and other issues that she said would matter for far more to voters this year. I find it very interesting because Abigail Spanberger was the same individual and is the same individual who obviously passed a bill to make her state, which is Virginia, because she's governor, uphold the popular vote. So based on a majority of the vote, if it happens to be the popular vote, vote Democrat. Even though some individuals voted Republican, even those Republican votes will turn all Democrat. So she basically passed the bill where the state would be a whole voter pool of Democrats if the popular vote in her state of Virginia happens to be a lot of Democrats voting. So if the popular vote is majority of the voters over there in Virginia that live in Virginia happen to vote Democrat, then even those who vote Republican, all their votes turn Democrat. So I find it very interesting that she's saying focus on affordability and not on redistricting and focus on the midterms, but she done the very thing that would change the trajectory in the votes when it comes to voting for the president. But anyway, let's get back to the article. She did not say she would oppose implementing a partisan gerrymander in Virginia before the 2028 elections. But the issue is one she and some other Democrats would prefer to leave aside for now and instead focus on the fall's midterm elections. For years, Democrats have cast themselves as the party of good governance, offering support for initiatives that mandate nonpartisan redistricting, but they also want to win, prompting Ms. Spanberger to focus on November. Quote unquote, anytime someone, whether it's Hakeem or anyone else, talks about some other point off in the future, it is a distraction from the task at hand, which is winning in November, she said. As for talking of redistricting, the governor said that time is over now. Mr. Jeffries, who declined to comment for this article, also mentioned the goal of flipping multiple seats in Virginia this year during his public remarks this week. At the conference, he pledged that Democrats would again seek to redraw Virginia's maps in the next 2 years. In his words, quote, "We're going to work as hard as we can in advance of 2028 to restore that 10-to-1 map because that's what the voters decided would be appropriate moving forward," quote, Mr. Jeffries said at the conference. The dust up comes during a week of internal conflict among Democrats who spent Thursday confounded by the Democratic National Committee's release of an error-ridden draft report about how and why then Vice President Kamala Harris lost the 2024 presidential election to Donald J. Trump. All right. So why is Spanberger blowing up at Jeffries? Because she sees something he either doesn't see or doesn't care about. She's telling the party to focus on affordability on Trump and on actually winning elections in November. Stop talking about redistricting. Stop talking about court takeovers. Let it go and move on. But here's the thing underneath all of that. The numbers don't look as good as Democrats want people to think. If you look at the polling,
We don't normally focus on sort of the variance in polls, but this is a time when it might really matter.
It might really matter. I'm going to put on my professor cap here, Professor Enton, Professor Berman, in the room with you, our dear students. And I think that, sometimes we sort of get lost, right? We focus in on one poll and one narrative, and sometimes there are competing narratives, and I think it's worth just taking a step back, because I think some people are like, well, the polls said one thing and another thing happened. Actually, the polls here differ quite a bit. Democrats lead in choice and choice for Congress. Look at this. New York Times poll came out yesterday, it's 10. That matches with Marist, that was 10. But the Washington Post came out within the last month, that was 5. Fox News came out in the last month, that was 5. And then the CNN poll that we were discussing last week, right? That was a 3-point lead. There's quite this bit of variance that is going on right here. And you know what? This is actually a good thing. This is a normal thing. This is what happens when you have margins of error that are going out there. You'd expect an average, but then you have a range of possible results around that average, and we're not necessarily sure which one is right if the election were held today. And of course, there's the extra variance of the fact that the election is not being held until November.
All right, a range of possible results. And in this case, You
want to hit a pen, Johnny.
I'm going to hit a pen. There we go.
There you go.
In this case, this result would be wildly different than that result.
Right. Okay. So you see, this is, of course, the choice, the national popular vote for the House. But what does that mean in terms of seats? What's the difference between, let's say, Democrats winning by 10 versus winning by 3? And this is where it gets really interesting. Okay. So even if you take redistricting into account, given a popular vote win of, let's say, 3 points, what would that mean for Democratic House gains? They gain probably somewhere, an estimate is between 0 and 6 seats, which at the upper end of that range would be enough to take back the House. But in the lower end of that range, that would not be. That would be Republicans holding on. But what about that 10-point lead that you see in Marist, the New York Times? Well, that would be a ginormous blowout. And this is just an estimate. It could be higher, a little bit higher, a little bit lower. But we're talking about an estimate of a Democratic gain of between 20 to 30 seats or more. They could be ending up 245 seats or north of there potentially, versus being stuck, let's say, 213, 214, 215, 216, maybe barely getting to a majority. So look, when you see this range of potential results, I want you to keep in mind, yes, Democrats are probably favored to take back the House. It's by no means a guarantee, but they could end up blowing the Republicans right out of the water. All of that is within the margin of error at this point, especially given that we're months from the election.
That's the difference between maybe not taking it and taking it by a lot. That's
Correct.
The variance in the polls right now. So, Professor Renton, what does one do? What does one do at this stage of the game when you have these polls showing all these different things?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, Professor Berman. And what we would do is we might average the polls together, and you can see that there's been a clear shift towards the Democrats in the average poll. Choice for Congress margin. You go back to Election Day last year, in November of 2025, Democrats were ahead by 4. They're now ahead by 7 in the average poll at this point. And that, if that average held, that will result very much assuredly a clear Democratic majority. And then the last little thing that I will note here is just, Kalshi prediction market chance that Democrats in the midterms, 218 House, and then let's say gaining in the Senate, but not necessarily taking it back. Look at this. 69% chance, a very nice 69% chance. So Democrats are still in the catbird seat here. They're likely to gain the House, likely to gain the Senate, but it's by no means a guarantee.
Harold Denton, thank you very much for that. An important look at what the data is saying.
So you looked at the polling. One poll has Democrats up 10 points in generic congressional preference. Another has them up 5 points. Then you got CNN's poll showing a 3-point lead, 3 points. That variance matters because a 3-point lead doesn't guarantee anything. If Democrats win the popular vote nationally by 3 points, they could still lose control of the House, and that's within the margin of error. That's how tight this actually is. Spanberger understands the math. If you go on television talking about maximum warfare, quote unquote, and court takeovers and forcing justices to resign, what are you actually telling independent voters? You're telling them that you care more about winning than you care about how you win. You lose the moderates. You fracture your own coalition. Jeffries is panicking because he's not confident about November either. And if he really believed there were going to be this massive blue wave, he claims, he wouldn't be so desperate to lock in redistricting advantages right now. So the uncertainty is eating him alive. So he's talking about 2028 like it's already decided. Spanberger gets the politics. She knows that talking about maximum warfare when you're trying to win suburban swing voters is a disaster. I mean, I'm pretty sure she would know that because she's the one that ran on, not raising taxes, and then she ended up raising taxes even to the point of walking your dog tax. But she's trying to pull the party back toward messaging that actually works. Jeffries is doubling down on something that already failed in Virginia, and that friction is why they're publicly at war. For years, Democrats built their whole brand around being the party of good governance and fair representation. They spend all this time talking about nonpartisan redistricting commission. It's their clean message. It posed well with moderates. Sounds legitimate on the surface, but here's how the problem. Here's the problem with that story. Nonpartisan commissions in blue states aren't actually nonpartisan. They're just partisan commissions filled with Democrats that have a better name. You call something a commission instead of a political operation, and suddenly it sounds legitimate. But the outcome is the same. You're picking your voters either way. Look at New England. Go through those districts. It's solid blue. But 40% of the voters in those states are Republican. How do you end up completely blue when 4 out of 10 people are voting Republican? That's not nonpartisan. That's gerrymandering with better marketing. And here's what actually happening. Democrats did this first. They maximized their own advantages. They got comfortable with an unfair system because it benefited them. The Republicans started fighting back and they said, okay, if that's the game you want to play, we're going to redraw our own districts. And Democrats act like Republicans invented cheating. They act shocked and outraged, but the Supreme Court's Voting Rights Act ruling basically said you can't have these heavily drawn minority districts anymore based on race, and open the door of Republicans to redistrict aggressively. And that's why Jeffries is panicking. Democrats had years of head start. They rode that advantage as far as it would go. Now Republicans are catching up and they hate it. And here's what's really happening underneath all of this. Democrats think an unfair advantage is their natural state. It's the baseline. It's the default. A level playing field looks like a loss to them. That's the fundamental difference between what Spanberger and Jeffries actually believe. Spanberger understands politics. If you go on camera and you're saying fight for power instead of representation, you lose the middle. You shatter your coalition. Jeffries either doesn't understand that or he's betting so hard on a blue wave that it doesn't matter. But we already know the polls don't support that confidence, and that's why one side is reading the data and understanding they're in trouble, and the other side is doubling down on something that already backfired in Virginia. So this whole situation is institutional overreach exposed when politicians prioritize their party's power over actual representation, and their own coalition, meaning their own party, or a party of supporters, party and supporters, we could say coalition wise, collapses from the inside. I will say their own party as coalition. I'll define coalition as their own party. Collapses from the inside. And Spanberger's right. They lost. Jeffrey's talking about court takeovers and maximum warfare. Just proves they care more about winning than governing. Drop a comment, tell me what you think or who you think is actually being honest here. Subscribe for more breakdowns nobody else will give you. Catch you in the next one on that No Family Peace.